Hello. I am Chris, and this is Strip Down Sunday. We are Soul Evolution Collaborative, and it is my pleasure and joy to be here with you today. So I hope everything in the world is treating you well. A couple things to get out of the way. So this is Strip Down Sunday. This is a time where we try to provide some inspiration, maybe some spiritual upliftment, or just taking a new look on life in our own Soul Evolution Collaborative kind of way. So we have stripped down the Sunday mornings to offer just this streamlined message, and hope that it is a powerful experience for you, for us, to bring an updated message of inspiration to the world, really at a time when we seem to need it the most. So the Soul Evolution Collaborative, we are dedicated to personal transformation and communal evolution. So 2 quick things. If you would like to learn more about us, everything you could want to know, you can find at soulevolutioncollaborative.org. I'm going to place that into the comments here. So feel free to click that and stroll over our site, check everything out there, see how you can get involved. We are actively creating and encouraging change in this world in ways that benefit everyone. So as we inspire personal transformation that leads to communal evolution, we like to make our world with room for everyone. So if you would like to help continue this vision, please consider making a donation at soulevolutioncollaborative.org. We gratefully welcome your support. All right, all that's out of the way. Let's jump in here today. It is a interesting conversation. We are talking about privilege. Now, before you turn away, because I know for some people, like just even saying that word is like instantly triggering, and it shuts down a lot of conversation that could be beneficial for us all. So first off, I just want to acknowledge that one, I think privilege maybe isn't the best word. What we're really talking about is unearned kind of advantages that are built into the system and that are perpetuated by that same very system. But a lot of people, when I talk about getting triggered, when they hear that idea of privilege, it seems to negate their own challenging situation. First off, I just want to acknowledge that I see you. I see all of us. Life is extremely challenging, more so for some people than others. But wherever you are at, when I say that, some people have some natural advantages over others, I'm not trying to negate the hard work that you've done in your life or the challenges that you faced or continue to face, all the hurdles. Privilege is really a wild kind of mix of different, you can be privileged in some areas while disadvantaged in other areas. It's not like a cut and dry one kind of definition fits everything. And so let's just start from that place. I'm not calling out any one individual for any one thing. We can't stereotype and just put people in these boxes, even though that's a bit of what this is going to maybe sound like today. But I want us to recognize that we are all human beings, and that, this conversation, it's not an easy one to have, but it is an important one to have. And if you've done some of this work around yourself, trying to uncover some of your own blind spots or unknown biases, then this is hard. It is very hard. And as you start to do this work, you will make mistakes. I'm guessing that today in this talk, I will have at least 10 things that I either should have said differently, or maybe I shouldn't have even said at all, because it's challenging. But I also know that the risk and rewards is worth having these conversations, putting ourselves out there, being, open to learning and growing and sharing awareness with others. So all that being said, I see you where you are. I am not saying that, everything was handed to you or everything could be handed to you or that it's that simple. I do want to acknowledge that, we're all in our own places. So that being said, think about some of the challenges or struggles, depending on where you are, who you are, where you're coming from. And so just imagine times where life has really, thrown you curveballs, the things that you've had to really struggle to get through or struggle to get ahead. Take all that in and just take a second to think about it. And then as you think about, these times that have brought you strife, don't go into, I don't want to trigger anybody into their worst memory right now, but I want to open up this idea of empathy. So now imagine the struggles, the hard times you've had, and now just open your awareness to other people who add on extra barriers with that. Imagine trying to get through that if you are somebody who is also, doesn't have access to the same sort of like healthcare or mental health treatments, access to, financial resources, maybe family help, neighbors. There's a lot of different things. So just imagining coming from your own place of the challenges that you faced, and then as we go through this talk, then just imagine, putting yourself in that place and adding on some of these extra barriers to just imagine how life can be even more challenging than you might be aware for some people. So, first off, want to acknowledge that when it comes to privilege, I tick a lot of the boxes of the advantaged kind of dominant group in society. I'm not, in a minority in any ways, unless I've, put myself in different areas of, work or in different groups that I've been able to be a part of, which if you've never been a minority in a room or in a group, I encourage you just to seek out, more experiences in life, because there's a lot to be learned when we can open up and, meet more people outside of our normal, like, kind of homogeneous group. So, I am privileged in many ways. Does that mean that my life is a breeze? No, it certainly does not. And so that's why I want you to also consider that this is not calling anyone out. So, if you watched Truth Be Told the other night, I'm just going to talk about some kind of ideas. There was a good example that I found. It was a professor who was doing a study, and they created a Monopoly game that had, it was two players, but one person started with $1,000. The other person started with $2,000. One person had, even the token was different. It was a Rolls Royce, or you had the old shoe. Every time you pass go, instead of getting, the one person who started with the advantage got $200 every time. The other person only got $100. The privileged person got 2 dice. The other person only got 1. So when you roll doubles, you get to roll again. All these little things added up, and they created the example of what's more realistic out in the world, of where, we all have our starting point when we go out into the world. And for some people, that starting point is way ahead of the starting point for many other people. And just that very starting point greatly affects what you are able to do. That brings up one other point, is that a lot of people get fearful that when we start to talk about privilege, that what we're doing is we're telling people in the underprivileged groups that the game is rigged against you and you will never succeed. That is not what this is saying at all, because people have succeeded. People have pulled themselves out, but they are the exception, not the norm. And the more that we talk about this, then the more we can start to kind of create that level playing field. So the Monopoly example was really fun. You can Google that and see a lot of stuff about it. But that also part of that game, the rigged Monopoly game, what the observers had witnessed was the one who is end up, winning, because they have all these different advantages. As the game progressed, their attitudes kind of shifted. They had, a bowl of pretzels there, and he would help himself they would help themselves as much as they could. Like, yeah, no big deal. I'm just sitting here. And the other person had a harder time, like, even wanting to kind of reach out. It plays this psychic or mental thing on us that when you have advantage, it's kind of our nature to start to feel like we earn it. And like what they noticed in observations, and like acknowledged observations from the person themselves, that they started to feel like they deserved to win, that they were playing the game better. And I think that's part of, I don't know where it comes from. I was going to say human nature, but maybe it's human nature. Maybe it's part, culturalization, that we have this idea of what success is in the United States. And so as people start to achieve more success, they also start to feel, the more they feel that they earned it, the more they feel they deserve it and that they're entitled to it. So it's very interesting just to look at human dynamics and, just to start to get an understanding of people that are sitting in different, positions of power and access and privilege, underneath it all, there's an unconscious kind of bias that they ultimately deserve it. And they start to kind of, it puts blinders on to where you just feel like everybody's got those same opportunities, which is just not true. Now, the really cool experiment or exercise that, really opened me up to some of these ideas. The name is Jane Elliott. And this is really, if you've never seen anything about Jane Elliott's work, she's no longer alive, but it was a truly amazing thing that she did. And it was the blue eyes, brown eyes exercise. And what she did was, she was a teacher. She wanted to teach about, kind of discrimination and racial preference. But what she did is she separated her class into students that had blue eyes or brown eyes. And then she told everybody that kids with blue eyes are naturally a little smarter than kids with brown eyes. And so we had to keep kids separate. So the kids with blue eyes received certain privileges and advantages that the kids with the brown eyes did not in the class. And what she witnessed was their behavior. Kids that used to get along and mix, pretty well, and, just be as kids are, started really taking that separation to heart and discriminating and being mean and calling names and pointing out, when something would happen, like, well, the brown-eyed, kid did this because they're just not as smart. They just didn't know, or, all these things, like, putting bad behaviors, associating them with the color of the kid's eyes. And they really took this on and owned it like that. Yes, they were superior. Absolutely. I see it. There's examples all over of it. And they start to point that out. But then after a day or two of the experiment and really watching kids' behavior shift, she came back in and said, wait a minute, I had it backwards. I was wrong. It's actually brown-eyed students who are smarter. I was wrong this whole time. Okay, so brown-eyed students, okay, you get the advantages now. You get to use the water fountain in the room. The other kids have to use the one down the hallway. And, all these different advantages that she put in place to demonstrate. And what was interesting is, as I was talking about, like, when you have positions of power and privilege, that you take it on and you own it, and you start to even perpetuate that divisiveness. So she flipped it, and then kids were considered to be superior, even though they had already experienced, being what's the word I'm looking for? Being discriminated against. When they were put in that position where they were considered the advantageous ones, their behavior, it mimicked the same as the blue-eyed kids was before. They started being kind of mean and cruel and oppressive to the blue-eyed students. So even having experienced how awful it felt to be on the receiving end of it, whatever this is in our part of our human nature took over and started doing the exact same thing to others. And so that's just something to become aware of. Like, this takes a lot of understanding and intention to overcome this. So when we talk about systemic racism or systemic discrimination in our society against marginalized groups, it's there, and it really runs deep to our core. And so as more people wake up and try to overcome those, whatever, I don't want to say inherent, because I believe that they're kind of learned over time. But then again, that's me, I'm a novice. But as we try to overcome these biases that exist in all of us, for some people, it is so counterintuitive and even impossible to get over that hurdle. So really, opening up a bit to empathy is key here into creating this, new world that we would like to see. So it's really interesting just to be aware of the natural tendencies to want to defend and protect that level of privilege that we have. I thought I would maybe some examples of how privilege can show up in the world in real consequential ways for people. I guess before I do, let's talk a little bit about just different places of privilege. The obvious one is white privilege compared to Black, Indigenous, people of color. That there is a natural bias that is out in our world. But it also, applies to LGBTQ IA plus communities. It can be, like the language you speak. It can be, rich and poor. There's all kinds of different levels of privilege. And again, like I mentioned at the very beginning, I know I missed hundreds of places, people, groups, demographics that are disadvantaged. And, I really want to just point out that it's not like as simple and cut and dry as it may sound coming out of my mouth. And I just want us to all be aware. Also, I talk about the experiences that I have learned about as, doing like research or over the years, different, articles and stories that I have, looked at. I know me coming, being a white, cisgendered, heterosexual male, that I do not have the authority to speak about anybody outside of that group's, their experience. And as I essentially go right against what I just said, I'm sharing stuff that I found, through different areas of study. But I also want to recognize, like, I cannot speak for the actual experience of other individuals. And if I misstep, I want to apologize now. I'm always open to feedback. If anybody wants to, feel free to let me know where I misspoke. And I also want to acknowledge that in the conversation of privilege, this is one of like the risks that people of the predominant class or predominant group risk. A lot of times we'll say something like, I just don't know. So we'll ask somebody from the marginalized community, can you teach me? And again, that's another form of, oppression, exploitation, to expect somebody who's already on the margins to then, educate us or myself is an unfair ask. And it also can create unconscious kind of divisive energies. And so it's not anybody's place to have to educate others outside of their group. It is my place, and I can only speak for myself and my own intention to learn as much as I can, to try to improve my behavior and find own blind spots within. And so that being said, like when I said that you can point out where I made mistakes, I'm not asking you to. I'm not expecting anybody to do that. But I also do say that I'm open, and if you feel like pointing out where I've misspoke, I'm open to that, because I do truly want to learn, but I don't expect anybody to have to teach me, because that's not fair either. So some of the ways, concrete ways that we have seen different forms of privilege show up in the world. A big one was the idea of redlining. And this was, I'm only going to be able to touch on these briefly, so feel free to Google and learn more about this if you are unfamiliar. So the concept of redlining happened in the United States, and it was after the Great Depression. The government passed government-backed mortgages to help people own homes and not be displaced at future recessions or whatnot. And what they found out is that certain areas, they had 4 zones, and some areas they deemed too risky to have these government-backed mortgages, and they used a lot of criteria like, well, it's near factories, or it's in this part of the stressed communities, and so those were not, people that lived in those areas or wanted to were not able to get these same government-backed loans. And it wasn't even made public, these maps, until like one person doing research in St. Louis discovered one and found out like the reason why he and members in his community had never been able to get the loans that they needed to try to start building, the equity that you have in your house and home ownership. And so then he exposed it. He called it the smoking gun, that there was actual government programs that were keeping these communities down. And, while they had different criteria of why some areas were distressed, and they called it more likely to default on their loans, the one common thing that existed in all the different criteria was that the majority of the people that lived there, or even some of the people that lived there, were people of color. This goes on to, like, I still to this day, it'll be like every few months I'll see another article, somebody wanting to sell their house, a person of color, African American, was the last time I saw this. And they had somebody come in to appraise their house, and this is an area, suburb where the houses, like the median house was like $500,000, and the appraisal came in. They the appraiser came in and did the appraisal, and it came in back at like 250, way below what they were expecting. And the reasons why weren't necessarily clear. And so what they did is what we do all the time. They call it like whitewashing the house to whatever. So they removed all like family pictures that made it clear that the people that lived there were African American, moved any kind of other cultural items and things like that, and then had somebody else come in and reappraise the house from that point, like even changing names on like who is asking for the appraisal. If it was a stereotypical African American sounding name, they changed it to sound more Anglo-Saxon. And happens time and time and again in these situations, they came back and then the appraisal came in back at 500,000 at what it was supposed to be. There's this kind of underlying bias that exists, and it's, I think in a lot of the cases, it's these blind spots that we don't even know that are there, and a lot of this still stems from that original redlining. Now, other areas of discrimination and privilege is jobs, to get job interviews. I've seen several studies that used the example of names of sounding either like Hispanic or African American or Asian, that you have a much better chance at getting an interview if you have a white sounding name that's here in the United States, where that's the controlling class or controlling subgroup, cultural group for eons. And so they would send out actual resumes that had all pretty much identical resumes to all these different companies, and the only thing they changed was a person's name, and the difference in callbacks was very substantial and statistically significant to say yes, there's happened there. So by having a white sounding name, you're in most cases over twice as likely to get a callback from the interviewer. One thing that's interesting is, as these conversations have been happening for decades and they're getting more and more out into the mainstream, there is improvement. So one study that was just focused on Asian sounding names found that applying at small businesses, there was a 40% disadvantage if you had an Asian sounding name. However, in that same market, there was only a 20% disadvantage for large businesses. And so I think that's indicative that we are making change, that things are improving for everybody in general. Now, one thing that's interesting is that people don't want to give up, don't want to speak out against their own self-interest. And I think that's one of the hindrances. Like if you are going up, job review and going for the job, you don't know if you got it just because you had a white sounding name or not. And that's normal to take that on. But now think about this. If you took the job and then you found out like, oh yeah, we hired you because it came down to you or somebody named whatever, a marginalized sounding name, would you still want to keep that job? I would like to think that if I found that out in my case, I would turn it down and let them know, why that was unfair. But most of the time, you would never even know that was the reason. But that's one of the hindrances, is because most people of that, like 99%, don't have enough privilege to be able to speak out against their own self-interest and be okay. And so that is part of the problem why this continues to perpetuate. All right, so let's look at a couple other things that shows up tangibly in the world. Here's something that relates to anybody, like it's just being poor. You are in the underprivileged class, and that can be discrimination if you have a speeding ticket. So a speeding ticket that's, say $300. Well, for somebody that's living paycheck to paycheck, that $300, that is very damaging and, can really cause harm to that person. But now that same law to somebody else who's making $250,000 a year, that $300 ticket's nothing. So essentially, like, it's against the law if you're poor, but otherwise it's just kind of like you pay the $300 and that's just the price you pay every now and then for being able to drive however you want. Going to court, if you are underprivileged and you don't have money for good representation, you are much more likely to suffer the most severe consequences, including incarceration. And so let's look at that. One other thing too is that in the United States, slavery is illegal. Is it? Is actually still legal by the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. It says that it is illegal except when being done as a punishment for a crime that the person was duly convicted. So if you are found guilty of a crime, you can be forced into slavery in your incarceration legally in the United States. And so then as we take that information and compare it to higher incarceration rates for people of color, for people that don't have the financial resources for better representation, it starts to raise lots of questions. And there's, for more examples, one of the best ones is the use of marijuana. So marijuana use amongst white people is relatively exactly the same as people of color, African Americans, and the whole population at large. However, African Americans are far more likely to be incarcerated when they have that same power. And where this all stems from, there's all kinds of different factors at play. But when you take into consideration that legalized slavery is available when people are incarcerated, and you look at the for-profit prison industry, and you look at other industries that use incarcerated prisoners for their labor, paying them 50 cents a day kind of wages in prison, we see how that system is very disadvantageous to those who don't have the resources to represent themselves. Not to mention, like, who's more likely to be arrested for a crime such as marijuana possession in the first place. So it is time after time after time that we see where being marginalized is very harmful. So again, like along the lines of having lack of financial resources, I lived in Naples, and when I moved there from Orlando, my auto insurance went down. I was moving to Naples, which is considered a fairly wealthy city. And then when I moved from there to Fort Myers, where the median income is much lower, my auto insurance went up a decent amount. And the only reason that I can think of is because the chances of getting in an accident with under or uninsured driver are greater in an area that has a median income. And so it's kind of like a double-edged sword. You're living in a place with lower income, everything else costs a little more. So it's, again, just advantages for those who have privilege. So there's so much that I could just talk on and on about, because everything that I say out loud, there's like 5 more things that points me to, or that I need to clarify. So I encourage you to do the work yourself. Look out there, find out what kind of privilege is in existence, and see, just to become aware. This is what I think a big part of it comes down to, is education. When we hear a lot of people who are very resistant to change, that don't want to change the system that benefits them, even if they don't acknowledge it. They use this idea that higher education is indoctrination. But really, it's just education. When you learn about the ways that this society has been built over the years, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's when it tugs at your heartstring and you want to make change. And people get very defensive, and people also don't want to give up any advantage they have or that they can pass on to their children. But if we really want to create more advantages in society for all people, including those who are sitting in positions of privilege, we have to have these conversations. We have to try to remove those barriers for as many people as we can. If we open up into a more transparent society, looking at just even things like wage equality, just looking at what is available to people, then we can start to live more from integrity and create more opportunities. Because when we lift up one person, we lift us all up. When we can help one marginalized group and in community be recognized in their humanity, and to make discrimination fade down a little bit, every time we do that, we lift up the whole, all of us. Because as we create a new world, it really begins by envisioning what that might look like. And all the diversity in the world, all these different groups that we get to be with. It really is a beautiful thing. And if we can just start to recognize and pull more people up to us, because it's up to people in privilege to do this, because when the people that are on the margins are the ones that are speaking out and saying, recognize me, they're making themselves even more vulnerable than they already were. And it's a lot to expect of them. I admire everyone that has been able to speak up and get the message out there. But it's really up to people in positions of power to recognize how we can lift everyone up. And so it comes down to just opening your mind, finding out what's been going on out there in the world, and do your best to be educated and willing to make mistakes. Because like I said, I'm sure I made several mistakes in what I spoke about today here. I left out so much of what I want to share because it keeps going. If you want to find out more about this, if you come join us tonight at Second Sunday Experience, that's at the soulevolutioncollaborative.org. We're going to have some sort of spiritual experience based around this. Just get involved out in the world and ask questions, because it all begins in our minds. We have to envision that the world can be more inclusive and equal and equitable and kind and compassionate. We have to be able to imagine that that's possible, and then we have to have conversations and ask how and why and where. How do we do this? And this is where it all begins. So find yourself good spiritual community. I recommend Soul Evolution Collaborative, and just continue loving, living, growing, learning, sharing, reaching out, finding people that are unlike yourself, and getting to know people and inviting your friends along for the journey. So I hope that some of that made sense, because it is so deep, so much to learn. I've got a long way to go myself, and everything I learn, I recognize that there's about another 3 or 4 things that I don't know. So be patient with yourself. Recognize that this idea of privilege doesn't mean that everything's handed to you. Recognize, yes, life's hard. Now imagine if you had another 5 barriers on top of that. How can we help remove those barriers? Think positive, be kind, love each other, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Be well. Come see us tonight.